I woke up wearing a wedding ring. At first, I honestly thought it was part of some stupid bachelor party prank. One of those cheap silver bands you buy from a joke shop for $5. Then I looked closer. It wasn't fake. It was a real gold ring. My stomach dropped. I sat up so fast that my head immediately reminded me why that was a terrible idea. It felt like someone had replaced my brain with a jackhammer. Sunlight poured through the hotel curtains, and every tiny movement made my skull pound harder. Ow! A groan answered from somewhere beside me. Stop moving! I froze. I knew that voice. Slowly, almost afraid of what I'd find, I turned my head. Thomas, my best friend of 9 years. He was lying next to me, still asleep, one arm thrown across the blanket, his dark hair sticking up in every direction imaginable. He looked just as miserable as I felt. Then his eyes cracked open. He stared at me. I stared back. Neither of us said anything. Finally, he frowned. Why are you looking at me like that? I didn't answer. Instead, I slowly lifted my left hand. So, Thomas followed my eyes. His expression changed instantly. No, he raised his own hand. He had the same ring. For a full 5 seconds, we simply stared at our hands. Then we both yelled at the exact same time. What? 2 hours earlier, or at least, according to the clock, because neither of us remembered them, we had been celebrating our friend Ethan's engagement in Las Vegas. Actually, no, that wasn't right. We remembered arriving. We remembered checking into the hotel. We remembered dinner. We remembered Ethan insisting everyone had to do one crazy thing before he got married. After that, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Thomas rubbed both hands over his face. This has to be fake. I hope so. It has to be. I really hope so. He pulled the ring off. Or at least he tried. It didn't move. Why is it stuck? I looked at mine. Mine too. Neither of us spoke. The silence somehow made everything worse. Finally, Thomas stood up. Or at least he attempted to. He made it exactly 2 steps before stopping dead. Daniel! What? He pointed toward the dresser. There are pictures. I followed his finger. Someone had lined up printed photo booth pictures across the hotel desk. My heartbeat sped up. The first photo showed the 2 of us laughing. Normal. The second, Thomas had an arm around my shoulders. Still normal. The third, we were wearing ridiculous white cowboy hats. The fourth, my mouth actually fell open. Thomas was dipping me dramatically while someone behind the camera showered us with fake flower petals. There was another picture underneath. Both of us holding up what looked suspiciously like a marriage certificate. No! Thomas picked it up. His face lost all color. Daniel! What? I think. His voice cracked. I think we actually got married. The next 30 minutes were complete chaos. We searched the room. Every drawer. Every bag. Every pocket. Neither of us could find anything explaining what had happened. Instead, we found more evidence. A receipt from something called Lucky Heart's Wedding Chapel. A tiny plastic bride figurine. A receipt for matching rings. And 2 matching hoodies. Front, just married. Back, don't ask questions. Thomas looked ready to throw himself out the hotel window. I'm calling Ethan. He grabbed his phone. Straight to voicemail. He called again. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. He probably turned his phone off. I said. He better be dead. That's a little harsh. I'll make it true. Despite everything, I laughed. Thomas looked at me. Then, against all logic, he laughed too. For about 10 seconds we stood there laughing like complete idiots. Mostly because the alternative was panicking. Then someone knocked on our hotel door. 3 quick knocks. Thomas and I looked at each other. You answer. No. You. The knocking came again. Finally, I opened it. Standing outside was a woman in her 40s wearing a neat blazer and carrying a clipboard. She smiled politely. Good morning. Neither of us answered. I'm looking for Daniel and Thomas. That's us. Wonderful. She smiled even wider. I'm here regarding your marriage paperwork. Everything inside me stopped. I'm sorry. She glanced down at the clipboard. You requested expedited filing yesterday. Thomas nearly choked. We requested what? The expedited license. She looked confused. You wanted everything legally processed immediately. I exchanged a horrified look with Thomas. The woman continued. Congratulations, by the way. Neither of us corrected her. Because we couldn't. Our brains had completely shut down. She handed me an envelope. Everything should be finalized by the end of today. Then she walked away. Just like that. Thomas slowly closed the door. Neither of us moved. Finally he whispered, Daniel. Yeah. I think we're actually married. I looked down at the envelope in my shaking hands. Then at the wedding ring that still refused to come off. Then back at my best friend. I had absolutely no idea how one night in Las Vegas had managed to turn into this. But somehow, my best friend and I had woken up as husbands. For the next hour, Thomas and I did everything we could think of to prove the marriage wasn't real. First, we searched our phones. That turned out to be a mistake. The first thing I found was a selfie of us outside a tiny white chapel with a glowing pink sign that read Lucky Heart's Wedding Chapel. Thomas was grinning so hard his eyes were almost closed. I was laughing with one arm around his shoulders. Neither of us looked drunk enough to explain what we'd apparently done. Keep scrolling, Thomas muttered. I don't know if I want to. You have to. The next picture made us both groan. We were holding hands. Another showed us feeding each other slices of wedding cake. Then came a short video. I hit play. The camera shook while Ethan laughed behind it. There they are, he shouted. The happiest newlyweds in Vegas. The video spun toward us. Thomas looked straight into the camera. I've known Daniel almost 10 years. He sounded emotional. Very emotional. And if I'm gonna marry anybody, he pointed at me dramatically. It's him. Everyone around him cheered. Then the camera turned toward me. Apparently I wasn't much better. I've already memorized his coffee order. I threw an arm around Thomas. I think that qualifies as true love. More cheering. The video ended. Thomas covered his face. I hate drunk me. I hate drunk me too. He sighed. We're never drinking tequila again. Agreed. Our phones held dozens of photos. Some were embarrassing. Some were funny. One was oddly sweet. It showed us sitting on the curb outside the chapel. No posing. No jokes. Just talking. Neither of us remembered that conversation. For some reason, that bothered me the most. What if? Thomas started quietly. What? What if we actually meant it? I looked at him. What do you mean? I mean. He rubbed the back of his neck. We obviously thought this was a good idea. Drunk people think lots of stupid things are good ideas. True. But. He didn't finish. Neither of us really wanted to. About 20 minutes later, Ethan finally answered his phone. The second his face appeared on the screen, Thomas exploded. Why did you let us get married? Ethan blinked. Oh. I was wondering when you'd wake up. Thomas looked like he was about to throw the phone across the room. Ethan. What? You watched this happen. I tried to stop you. You did not. I absolutely did. He held up both hands. You guys wouldn't listen. I grabbed the phone. Start from the beginning. Ethan sighed dramatically. Fine. He leaned back. So. After dinner, everyone went bar hopping. We remember that. Then Thomas found karaoke. Thomas groaned. I knew it. You sang 4 songs. I don't sing. You absolutely do after tequila. I couldn't help smiling. That sounded exactly like Thomas. Ethan continued. After karaoke, somebody joked that you two already acted like an old married couple. Thomas frowned. Who? I honestly don't remember. What happened then? Ethan laughed. You two spent the next hour trying to prove you weren't secretly married already. I exchanged a confused look with Thomas. What does that even mean? You finished each other's sentences. You ordered each other's drinks. You argued over directions like an actual couple. You remembered weird little things about each other. Thomas looked uncomfortable. So? Ethan shrugged. Someone finally said. He paused dramatically. Just get married already. Neither of us spoke. And then, I asked. You both looked at each other. You high-fived. And Thomas said. Ethan tried not to laugh. Honestly? That sounds hilarious. Thomas slowly closed his eyes. Oh no. And Daniel? I immediately regretted asking. You said. Ethan grinned. At least I know he won't forget our anniversary. Thomas started laughing despite himself. I actually said that? You absolutely did. I kind of walked into that one. You really did. But here's the weird part, Ethan continued. The joke should have ended there. It didn't. You two actually left. By yourselves. For almost 2 hours. Thomas frowned. You didn't come with us? No. We thought you were getting food. Weren't you? Neither of us answered. Because neither of us remembered. When you came back, Ethan's smile softened. You weren't acting like idiots anymore. What do you mean? You were. He searched for the right word. Quiet. Happy. Just. He shrugged. Different. Thomas looked at me. I looked back. What happened in those 2 hours? I asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. I honestly don't know. The call ended without giving us any real answers. If anything, we had more questions than before. Thomas flopped backward onto the bed. This is a disaster. It might still be fixable. You think? We can get an annulment. Probably. I hope. Neither of us sounded convinced. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. Hello. Good afternoon, Mr. Carter. I blinked. Who? I'm calling from Lucky Heart's wedding chapel. Thomas sat up immediately. The minister who performed your ceremony asked me to let you know that something was left behind. I frowned. Left behind? Yes. What? A sealed letter. Thomas mouthed. A letter? The woman continued. You specifically instructed us not to give it to either of you until the following day. A chill ran through me. We did. Yes. It was written before your ceremony. I looked at Thomas. His expression mirrored mine. The woman asked gently, Would you like to come pick it up? Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I answered. We'll be there in 30 minutes. I ended the call. Thomas stared at me. A letter. I nodded slowly. Apparently, we wrote something before we got married. Neither of us remembered writing it. And somehow, that made me even more nervous than the marriage itself. The chapel looked a lot less magical in daylight. The glowing lights we'd seen in the photos were off, replaced by a plain white building squeezed between a souvenir shop and a tiny coffee stand. It looked ordinary. Thomas parked the rental car but didn't move. You ready? No. Me neither. We sat there another 30 seconds before finally getting out. The woman behind the front desk recognized us immediately. There they are, she said with a smile. Our newlyweds. Thomas winced. Can we skip that part? She laughed politely. I suppose. She disappeared into a back office and returned carrying a large cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. My name was written on one side, Thomas's on the other. Our officiant asked me to remind you of something. I frowned. What? She smiled knowingly. You made us promise not to answer any questions today. Thomas blinked. What? You said the letters would explain everything. She slid the envelope across the counter. And you insisted that no matter how much you begged, we weren't allowed to tell you what happened after you arrived. I stared at her. We actually said that? Oh, very seriously. Thomas rubbed his forehead. Drunk us were incredibly organized. She smiled. Actually, her expression softened. You didn't seem drunk anymore. That caught both of our attention. What do you mean? I asked. You arrived laughing. She thought for a moment. But before the ceremony, you sat together for almost an hour. You talked. Quietly. I remember thinking I'd never seen two people look at each other the way you did. Thomas shifted awkwardly. And then, You asked everyone else to leave, so the two of you could talk alone. Neither of us remembered any of it. We waited until we reached a quiet park before opening the envelope. There were 2 folded letters inside. One addressed to me, one addressed to Thomas. Same handwriting. Mine. Thomas held his own letter but didn't open it. You first. You sure? If yours says we're idiots, I want confirmation before I read mine. Despite everything, I smiled. Then I unfolded the paper. The first line stopped me cold. Daniel, if you're reading this, then you probably don't remember writing it. I looked up at Thomas. He was already staring at me. Keep going, he said quietly. I swallowed. Honestly, I expected that. You always forget things after too much tequila. I almost laughed. That sounded painfully accurate. Then the tone changed. But I hope one thing survived. The conversation Thomas and I just had. I frowned. What? Thomas asked. I kept reading. We've spent years pretending we're just best friends because it's easier than asking the questions we're both afraid of. My heartbeat quickened. Tonight, we finally stopped pretending. I looked up. Thomas hadn't opened his letter yet. What is it? He asked. I hesitated. You should read yours. Thomas unfolded his letter. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds around us were distant traffic and children laughing somewhere across the park. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. I'm reading. His voice sounded strangely nervous. Thomas, if you're reading this, then congratulations. You finally stopped lying to yourself. He stopped. His eyes stayed locked on the page. I watched his expression slowly change. Confusion. Disbelief. Then something softer. He continued. You asked Daniel something tonight that you've wanted to ask for years. His voice became almost a whisper. He answered. Thomas lowered the paper. Daniel. I couldn't answer, because my own letter continued with almost the same sentence. Tonight, Thomas finally admitted why every relationship he's had eventually failed. I stared at the words, because every time someone asked him what his perfect future looked like, he always pictured you standing next to him. The world suddenly felt very quiet. I slowly looked at Thomas. He wasn't reading anymore. He was staring at me. He stopped. I don't remember saying that. I nodded slowly. Neither do I. But. He looked back down. I wrote it. So did I. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Eventually, Thomas laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because he didn't know what else to do. This is insane. It is. You don't actually think. He couldn't finish. I looked down at my letter again. The last paragraph caught my eye. If we wake up tomorrow and decide this was just alcohol talking, we'll get an annulment. No hard feelings. We'll still be best friends. I turned the page over. There was one final sentence, written larger than the rest. But if even a tiny part of us still feels the same tomorrow, maybe we should finally stop pretending nothing has been happening between us for years. I swallowed. Thomas was reading the exact same line on his page. He folded the letter carefully. I don't know what to think. Neither do I. He leaned back against the park bench. I mean, we've always been close. Really close. I smiled slightly. You once drove 6 hours because my car broke down. You would have done the same. I would have. You remember when my dad was in the hospital? I nodded. I didn't even ask you to come. You were already there. I looked down. You were family. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Thomas looked at me. For some reason, that single sentence carried more weight than either of us expected. On the drive back to the hotel, neither of us turned the radio on. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Halfway there, Thomas suddenly spoke. Can I ask you something? Sure. If none of this had happened, he kept his eyes on the road. Would you have ever thought about us? I stared out the passenger window. Could have lied. Probably should have. Instead, I answered honestly. Once or twice. Thomas smiled without looking at me. Only once or twice? I laughed quietly. Fine. More than that. He nodded slowly. Me too. Neither of us said another word. But for the first time since waking up, the wedding rings on our fingers didn't feel quite as impossible as they had that morning. Back at the hotel, Thomas tossed his wallet onto the dresser and collapsed onto the edge of the bed. Neither of us had said much during the drive back. The letters had answered one question, but they had created a dozen more. I sat in the chair by the window, turning my wedding ring around my finger. It still wouldn't come off. "You know what's bothering me?" Thomas finally asked. "What?" "I don't remember telling you." "Telling me what?" He looked down at his hands. "Any of it." I knew exactly what he meant. Neither of us remembered confessing anything. Yet we'd both written about it. "I almost wish it had been a joke," he admitted. "But it wasn't." "No." He let out a slow breath. It felt real. Around noon, Ethan finally knocked on our door. He stepped inside carrying coffee for both of us. "You two look terrible." "We feel worse," Thomas answered. "I figured." He handed us the cups before sitting in the desk chair. "So," he looked back and forth between us. "You found the letters." I blinked. "You knew." "I knew there were letters." "You didn't know what they said?" He shook his head. "No. You wouldn't let anyone read them." Thomas frowned. "We really thought this through." "You did." Ethan smiled faintly. "I've honestly never seen either of you that serious." I leaned forward. "Ethan, what happened after we left the bar?" He rubbed his chin. "I only know part of it." "Tell us." "You disappeared for almost 2 hours. When you finally came back, you weren't acting drunk anymore. You looked calm." Thomas exchanged a glance with me. "The two of you sat together while everyone else kept partying. You barely spoke. But every few minutes," he smiled, "you'd look at each other." "What kind of look?" Ethan shrugged. "The kind that made everybody stop making jokes." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he laughed softly, "nobody thought it was funny anymore. It suddenly felt," he searched for the word, "real." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "And then," Thomas asked if anyone knew where the nearest wedding chapel was. My heart skipped. Ethan continued, "I thought you were kidding. So did everybody else." But Daniel stood up. He pointed at me and said, he grinned, "Guess we're doing this." I buried my face in my hands. "Oh my God. That's exactly what you said." "There was one more thing." Ethan's smile disappeared. "What?" "You asked everyone not to follow you." "Why?" "I don't know. You just said." He thought for a second. "If we come back, we want whatever happens next to be our decision." The room fell silent. Thomas stared at the floor. "Our decision," he repeated quietly. Ethan nodded. "I think whatever happened in those 2 hours." He stood up. "It mattered." Before leaving, he stopped at the door. "For what it's worth." We both looked up. "I've known you guys almost as long as you've known each other." He smiled. "I've never met two people who cared about each other more." Then he left. That evening we decided to walk. Mostly because sitting in the hotel room wasn't helping. Las Vegas felt completely different during the day. Families wandered the sidewalks. Street performers entertained tourists. Music drifted from every direction. It all felt strangely normal. Thomas nudged my shoulder. "You hungry?" "I could eat. There's a burger place across the street. Works for me." We ordered food and found a booth near the window. Halfway through eating, the waitress approached with a smile. "There you are." Thomas frowned. "Us. You came in last night." She laughed. "The honeymoon couple." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Thomas nearly dropped his drink. "You remember us?" "Of course. You two were adorable." Neither of us knew how to respond. She continued, "You couldn't stop smiling. You even made everyone else clap when you kissed." Thomas choked on his soda. "I'm sorry." "You what?" She blinked. "You kissed." I looked at Thomas. He looked at me. Neither of us remembered that. Not even a little. The waitress tilted her head. "Wait. You really don't remember?" We slowly shook our heads. Her smile softened. Oh, she looked genuinely surprised. Well, I hope you remember one thing. What? The way you looked at each other. Thomas shifted awkwardly. What do you mean? She rested her tray against her hip. I work double shifts. I see couples every day. Most of them barely talk. She smiled. You two spent an hour here. You laughed. You finished each other's stories. And every time one of you got distracted, the other one reached across the table without thinking. I frowned. Reached. She nodded. You kept holding hands. Thomas and I instinctively looked down at the table between us. Our hands were only a few inches apart, almost close enough to touch. Without saying a word, we both quietly moved them back. The waitress laughed. See? What? You just did it again. We stared at her. You move exactly the same. Then she walked away to another table. Dinner ended much quieter than it had started. Outside, Thomas shoved his hands into his pockets. You know. What? I keep hoping someone will tell us we imagined all this. I nodded. Instead, everybody keeps telling us the same thing. Yeah. He stopped walking. So either every stranger in Vegas is messing with us, or, he met my eyes, or we've been lying to ourselves for a very long time. I didn't have an answer, because deep down, I was starting to wonder the exact same thing. As we reached the hotel entrance, Thomas hesitated. Daniel. Yeah. If we weren't married right now. I waited. Do you think we'd finally be having this conversation anyway? For a long moment I couldn't speak. Then I smiled sadly. I think I would have been too scared. Thomas looked at me with an expression I'd never quite seen before. So would have I. Neither of us noticed that we'd been standing there for nearly a minute, still wearing our wedding rings. And for the first time since waking up, neither of us tried to take them off. The next morning, I woke up before Thomas. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I saw the ring on my finger. Yesterday came rushing back. Las Vegas, the chapel, the letters, the conversations we couldn't remember. I rubbed my face and quietly slipped out of bed, heading downstairs for coffee. The hotel cafe was nearly empty. I had just sat down when someone stopped beside my table. Daniel. I looked up. Took me a second to recognize him. The minister from the wedding chapel. He smiled politely. I thought that was you. I stood automatically. Oh, hi. I hope you're both doing well. I laughed awkwardly. We're figuring things out. He nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. I imagined you might be. He asked if he could sit down. For some reason, I said yes. I know your receptionist wasn't allowed to answer your questions, I said. He smiled. That was your request. I know. But I hesitated. Can I ask one thing? As long as it doesn't involve the details you specifically asked me to keep private. I frowned. We really covered everything, didn't we? You certainly tried. Despite myself, I smiled. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me since yesterday. Were we actually serious? His expression became thoughtful. In all my years performing weddings, I've seen every kind of couple. People who wanted a funny story. People who were clearly making a mistake. People too intoxicated to understand what they were doing. He looked directly at me. You weren't any of those. A strange feeling settled in my chest. You spent nearly an hour talking before the ceremony. What about? He smiled apologetically. I promised. Right? But I can tell you one thing. I waited. When I asked if either of you wanted more time, you both answered at exactly the same moment. What did we say? No. His smile widened slightly. We've already waited long enough. Those words stayed with me the entire walk back upstairs. We've already waited long enough. Waited for what? For courage? For each other? Or for the right excuse to finally say something we'd both been avoiding? I didn't know, but the sentence refused to leave my mind. Thomas was awake when I returned. You disappeared. I went for coffee. You could have woken me. I figured you needed sleep. He noticed the second cup in my hand. You brought me one? You always order a vanilla latte. He blinked. You remembered. I laughed. You've been ordering the same thing for 7 years. He accepted the cup with a smile. Thanks. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me. You okay? I ran into the minister. His eyebrows lifted. You did. I nodded and told him everything. Thomas listened quietly. When I finished, he stared into his coffee. We've already waited long enough, he repeated softly. I keep wondering what that means. So do I. After checking out of the hotel, we headed to the airport. Our flight home wasn't until late afternoon, leaving us with several hours to kill. We wandered through a nearby outdoor shopping district without much of a plan. Eventually, Thomas stopped in front of a jewelry store. What? I asked. He looked at the display window. Our rings. I glanced down. Neither of us had mentioned them all morning. They still won't come off. I know. He hesitated. Do you? He stopped. What? Do you actually want to take yours off? The question caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because the honest answer surprised even me. I don't know. Thomas looked relieved. I thought I was the only one. An hour later, we found ourselves sitting on a bench outside the airport. Planes crossed the sky overhead. People hurried past with rolling suitcases. Everything around us kept moving. Only we seemed stuck. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Can I tell you something stupid? When have I ever stopped you? He smiled. When we were 21. I almost kissed you. I stared at him. What? He looked embarrassed. It was after your birthday. Pieces of that night slowly came back. We'd celebrated with friends. Everyone else had gone home. We'd sat on the roof of my apartment building talking until sunrise. You remember? He asked. I nodded slowly. A little. You fell asleep on my shoulder. I remember waking up. Thomas laughed quietly. You looked so peaceful. He rubbed the back of his neck. I leaned in. My heartbeat quickened. And then, I panicked. So I pretended I was fixing your hair. I couldn't help laughing. Seriously. I'm serious. I shook my head in disbelief. I thought you were brushing something off my forehead. I know. There was a brief silence. Then I admitted something of my own. I wasn't asleep. Thomas turned toward me. You weren't. I woke up when you touched my face. His eyes widened. You did. I smiled sheepishly. Pretended I was still asleep. He stared at me. Why? Because if I'd opened my eyes, I would have wanted you to kiss me. Neither of us spoke. The sounds of the airport faded into the background. For what felt like forever, we simply looked at each other. Finally, Thomas let out a slow breath. We're really good at terrible timing. I laughed softly. Apparently. He nodded toward our wedding rings. Maybe that's why Vegas happened. What do you mean? We finally ran out of excuses. Before I could answer, the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Our flight was beginning to board. Thomas stood, picking up his bag. You ready to go home? I looked at him, at the ring on his hand, then at the identical one on mine. No, I admitted. But I think. I smiled faintly. I'm finally ready to find out what happens when we get there. Thomas smiled back. So am I. Together, we walked toward the gate. Not quite sure whether we were flying home as best friends, or as two men who had accidentally uncovered feelings that had been waiting for years. Home felt different, not because anything had changed, because we had. Thomas and I had lived in the same city for years. We each had our own apartments only 15 minutes apart, close enough that one of us usually ended up at the other's place at least twice a week. Movie nights, football games, late-night takeout, helping each other assemble furniture. It had always seemed normal. Now, every memory looked different. 3 days passed. We barely talked. Not because we were avoiding each other. We were giving each other space. Or at least that was the excuse. In reality, I spent those 3 days replaying everything we'd said in Vegas. The letters, The photos, the waitress, the minister, and especially the moment at the airport. I almost kissed you. I would have wanted you to. I couldn't stop thinking about it. On the fourth evening, my phone buzzed. Thomas, you busy? I stared at the message for almost a minute. Daniel, no. 3 dots appeared immediately. Thomas, can I come over? 20 minutes later, he was standing outside my apartment carrying a pizza. I opened the door. Neither of us moved. Finally, he held up the pizza box. I figured serious conversations are easier with food. I laughed. Probably. He smiled. Can I come in? You never have to ask. The words came out automatically. Thomas noticed. So, he said quietly, some things haven't changed. No, they haven't. Dinner started exactly like every other dinner we'd ever shared. We argued over toppings. He stole fries from my plate. I complained. He ignored me. It felt so familiar that, for a while, I almost forgot everything else. Until he suddenly asked, do you remember sophomore year? I frowned. When? The snowstorm. I laughed. Which one? The one where my heating stopped working. Oh, I definitely remembered. His apartment had been freezing. He'd shown up at my door wrapped in 2 hoodies carrying a sleeping bag. You let me stay for 4 days. You would have frozen. I know. He smiled. You gave me your bed. You complained my couch hurt your back. You slept on the couch anyway. I shrugged. It wasn't a big deal. Thomas looked at me for a long moment. It kind of was. He reached into his backpack. I found something. He handed me an old photograph. I immediately recognized it. Someone had taken it during that snowstorm. Thomas was asleep on my couch. I was asleep sitting on the floor beside him with my head resting against the cushions. I laughed. I forgot this existed. I didn't. I turned the picture over. There was handwriting on the back. Not mine. Not Thomas's. It belonged to Ethan. One of these idiots is going to figure it out eventually. I blinked. Seriously? Thomas nodded. I found a whole stack of old pictures. Almost everyone had comments like that. What? They're basically dating already. Just kiss already. Everyone knows except them. I looked at him in disbelief. People thought that? For years. We spent the next hour looking through old photos on his phone. Camping trips, birthdays, beach vacations, game nights. In almost every picture, we were standing next to each other. Without thinking, without planning it. Always together. Thomas zoomed in on one picture from 2 years earlier. Look. I frowned. What? Our hands. I looked closer. Neither of us had noticed it before. We weren't exactly holding hands, but my fingers were resting lightly on his wrist while we laughed at something outside the frame. Neither of us seemed aware of it. That's... I started. Yeah. Thomas smiled softly. We touched each other all the time. I never noticed. Neither did I. As the evening grew quieter, Thomas stood and walked toward my balcony. I joined him. The city lights stretched across the skyline. For a while, we simply stood there. Then he spoke. I went on 3 dates last year. I know. They all asked me the same question. What question? Who's Daniel? I turned toward him. What? He laughed quietly. I talked about you too much. I didn't know what to say. They thought I was in love with you. My heart started beating faster. What did you tell them? I said they were ridiculous. He smiled sadly. Turns out they weren't. The words hung between us. Heavy. Honest. Real. I took a slow breath. I should probably tell you something. Thomas nodded. When I dated Melissa, the teacher, yeah, she broke up with me because... I looked down at my hands. She said she'd never be the most important person in my life. Thomas frowned. What did you say? I argued with her. And I realized she was right. He stared at me. You were. Neither of us spoke. The silence said enough. Thomas stepped closer. Not dramatically, just one small step. Close enough that I could see the nervousness in his eyes. I've been thinking about something. What if Vegas had never happened? I think we would have kept doing this forever. Doing what? Living around the truth. I nodded slowly. I think so too. He smiled. I don't want to anymore. For the first time in years, there were no jokes, no teasing, no excuses. Just two best friends finally saying the things they'd buried for far too long. Thomas reached for my hand, slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. Our fingers intertwined naturally, almost frighteningly naturally, like they'd done it 1,000 times before. He looked down at our hands, then back at me. This feels familiar. I smiled. It really does. Neither of us rushed the moment. Neither of us needed to. Whatever had started in Vegas, it hadn't been created there. It had simply been uncovered. And standing on that balcony with my best friend holding my hand, I realized something. The biggest surprise wasn't that we'd accidentally gotten married. It was that somewhere deep inside, part of me had been hoping for this long before either of us had been brave enough to admit it. After that night on my balcony, nothing officially changed. And somehow, everything did. Thomas didn't kiss me. I didn't kiss him. We simply stood there holding hands until the city lights blurred together beneath us. When he finally let go, neither of us acted awkward. Felt strangely peaceful, like we'd finally stopped carrying something heavy. The next morning, my phone rang before I'd even finished making coffee. Thomas. Morning. Morning. You busy today? Not really. There was a short pause. Want to spend the day together? I smiled before I could stop myself. I thought we already did that. I mean, he laughed. As an actual date. The word hung in the air. Date. Not hanging out. Not grabbing lunch. Not movie night. A date. I'd like that, I answered. So would I. He picked me up an hour later. Neither of us had discussed where we were going. Thomas just drove. You realize you still haven't told me the plan. I know. Should I be worried? Maybe a little. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of the small lakeside park we'd visited dozens of times over the years. I laughed. This is your big surprise? He looked almost offended. It gets better. We walked along the shoreline, coffee in hand, talking about everything except Vegas. Work, family, a new restaurant Ethan wanted us to try. Felt exactly like old times. Except every now and then our shoulders brushed. Neither of us moved away. Eventually we reached the old wooden dock. Thomas leaned against the railing. You remember the first time we came here? I nodded immediately. We'd only known each other a month. You pushed me into the lake. You deserved it. I absolutely did not. You stole my fries. He pointed at me. I asked for one. You took half. He laughed. Worth it. For a while we simply watched the water. Then Thomas reached into his jacket pocket. I've been carrying something around. He unfolded the letter from Vegas. His letter. The one we wrote. I nodded. I've read mine almost every day. So have I. He looked down at the paper. I think I finally understand something. What? We weren't trying to convince ourselves to get married. He looked at me. We were giving ourselves permission to stop being afraid. I took my own folded letter from my wallet. It was already worn around the edges. I've been thinking about one sentence. We've already waited long enough. Thomas smiled softly. I think we had. He folded the letter again. I wasted years assuming you could never feel the same way. I laughed quietly. I did exactly the same thing. We're kind of idiots. The biggest. He nodded toward my left hand. You still wearing it? I looked at my wedding ring. I never took it off. Me neither. The afternoon slipped by without either of us noticing. We rented a paddle boat. Thomas cheated at mini-golf. I still insisted the scorekeeper had miscounted. He insisted I was just a sore loser. Felt light, easy, comfortable. Not because we were pretending nothing had happened. Because we finally weren't pretending anymore. As the sun began to set, we found ourselves back at my apartment building. Neither of us made a move to get out of the car. Thomas rested both hands on the steering wheel. So, I've been thinking. Dangerous. It usually is. He smiled. We've spent almost 10 years acting like we're each other's person. I nodded. We have. And now, he took a deep breath. I don't want to act anymore. He turned toward me completely. Daniel, I love you. The words were simple, quiet, completely free of drama, which somehow made them hit even harder. I think I've loved you for a very long time. My eyes burned, not because I was surprised, because hearing it out loud made everything suddenly make sense. Every late-night phone call, every canceled date to help one another, every holiday spent together, every goodbye that lasted just a little too long. I reached across the center console and took his hand. I love you too. I probably have for years. Thomas laughed through watery eyes. We're really bad at this. We're 10 years late. Better than never. Much better. He squeezed my hand gently. Can I kiss my husband now? I couldn't help smiling. I was wondering how long it would take you to ask. He leaned across the console slowly, giving me every chance to change my mind. I closed the distance instead. Our first kiss wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no cheering crowds, no movie soundtrack, just a soft, careful kiss that felt strangely familiar, like we'd finally arrived somewhere we'd been walking toward for years. When we pulled apart, Thomas rested his forehead against mine. So, still think we should get an annulment? I looked down at the ring on my finger, then back at him. I smiled. No, I don't think I do. Thomas's smile grew wider than I'd ever seen it. Good, because I was hoping you'd say that. We sat there laughing quietly together, already knowing that the hardest conversation was finally behind us. Only one thing remained: telling everyone that what had started as an accident was now the life we both wanted. Telling our families turned out to be a lot less dramatic than either of us expected. Mostly because nobody seemed particularly surprised. That was the part neither of us had prepared for. Ethan insisted on hosting a barbecue the following weekend. The newlyweds have an announcement, he told everyone in the group chat. Thomas immediately texted him. You are the worst. Ethan's reply came almost instantly. Correct. See you Saturday. By the time we arrived, most of our friends were already there. The backyard buzzed with conversation, burgers on the grill, and someone arguing over music. The second Ethan spotted us, he walked over wearing the biggest grin I'd ever seen. So, he looked at both of us. You two figured it out? Thomas sighed. You knew. I suspected. You knew. I was about 99% sure. I laughed. What gave it away? Ethan looked genuinely confused. Everything. Once everyone had food, Thomas stood up. I guess we should say something. The conversations around the yard slowly quieted. He looked at me. I nodded. Then he faced everyone. So, he rubbed the back of his neck. Daniel and I aren't getting the marriage annulled. For about 2 seconds, nobody reacted. Then our friend Mason simply nodded. Finally, Thomas blinked. Finally, Mason looked around the group. What? You guys seriously didn't know? Several people started laughing. Our friend Lily raised her hand. I lost $50 because I guessed it had happened before 30. You had a bet? Thomas asked in disbelief. A very long-running one, Ethan admitted. Started 4 years ago. I stared at all of them. You all thought we'd end up together? Lily nearly choked on her drink. Daniel, she laughed. You once left your own birthday party because Thomas had the flu. He needed soup. You drove across town at midnight. He was sick. Mason pointed at Thomas. And this idiot skipped a job interview because Daniel's grandmother needed help moving. Thomas shrugged. Family comes first. The entire group looked at us. Exactly the same expression. One of complete disbelief. Ethan finally said what everyone else was thinking. You've been acting like an old married couple for years. Thomas and I exchanged a look. Then we both started laughing. Because they were right. Later that afternoon, Thomas and I slipped away from the noise and wandered toward the small lake behind Ethan's neighborhood. He bumped my shoulder lightly. I can't believe they had a betting pool. I'm more offended nobody told us. They probably assumed we already knew. I smiled. Apparently everyone knew except us. Thomas stopped walking. He reached into his pocket. I've been carrying this around since Vegas. He held up the folded marriage certificate. It survived the whole trip. I looked at the paper. So, he smiled. I've been thinking. Dangerous. It usually is. He unfolded the certificate carefully. You remember how we kept asking whether the marriage was real? I nodded. I think we were asking the wrong question. What do you mean? He took my hand. The paperwork was always real. He intertwined our fingers. The question was whether we were. I smiled. And he looked into my eyes. I've never been more certain of anything. A month later, we returned to Las Vegas. Not because we had to, because we wanted to. The little white chapel looked exactly the same. The receptionist recognized us immediately. I was wondering if I'd ever see you two again. Thomas smiled. We figured something out. I can see that. She looked at our joined hands. The minister came out a moment later. He smiled the second he recognized us. I was hoping this wasn't for an annulment. Thomas laughed. Actually, he glanced at me. We wanted to thank you. The minister looked genuinely touched. For what? I answered. For reminding us that sometimes the biggest decisions aren't made in a single night. They're made over years. We just finally admitted it. He nodded thoughtfully. I had a feeling. Before we left, Thomas asked someone to take a picture of us outside the chapel. This time there were no cowboy hats, no tequila, no blurry memories, just the two of us, completely sober, completely certain. As the camera clicked, Thomas leaned close enough that only I could hear him. You know. What? I'm still waiting for a proper proposal. I laughed. We're already married. I know. But I still want one. I pretended to think about it. Then I stepped back, reached into my pocket, and pulled out the same wedding ring I'd briefly managed to remove after having it professionally resized. Thomas's eyes widened. You planned this? For weeks. Right there on the sidewalk, in front of the tiny chapel where we'd accidentally changed our lives, I smiled at my best friend. The man who had spent nearly a decade being my favorite person without either of us being brave enough to say why. Thomas. He laughed softly. You're proposing to your own husband. I am. That's ridiculous. I know. So. I took his hand. This time I'm asking while we're both completely sober. His eyes were shining now. Thomas, will you keep being my husband? He didn't even pretend to think about it. He pulled me into a hug so quickly that I almost lost my balance. I was hoping you'd ask. Kissed him, laughing. I'll take that as a yes. It's the easiest yes I've ever given. Sometimes people ask us how we met. Sometimes they ask how we got married. We usually tell them the short version. Vegas. People laugh. They assume that's the whole story. It isn't. The truth is much simpler. We didn't fall in love in Las Vegas. We fell in love over years of late-night conversations, road trips, bad jokes, hospital waiting rooms, birthdays, and ordinary Tuesdays. Vegas didn't create our story. It simply forced us to stop pretending we were only best friends. And honestly, waking up married to Thomas was the biggest surprise of my life. Realizing he'd felt the same way all along, that was the part that changed everything.